Picture this. You're about to discover one of history's most peculiar economic stories, how ancient Rome turned human urine into a thriving industry and tax revenue stream. So sit back, grab a cup of tea, and get ready to explore how the Romans collected pee for profit, how Emperor Vespasian defended taxing it with a phrase that still echoes today, and why, quite literally, money didn't stink in ancient Rome. We'll journey through the bustling laundry shops of Pompeii, meet the hard-working fullers who transformed dirty togas into gleaming white garments, understand the surprising chemistry behind urine's cleaning power, and discover how a desperate emperor's creative taxation gave birth to a proverb that has survived 2,000 years. In the heart of ancient Rome, on any given morning, you might have encountered a peculiar sight that would seem utterly bizarre to modern eyes. Throughout the city streets, at regular intervals, stood large terracotta jars, amphorae cut in half and repurposed for a rather unglamorous function. These vessels, placed strategically at street corners and outside public buildings, served as public urinals. But, unlike our modern facilities, these weren't simply disposal points for human waste. They were, in fact, collection points for one of Rome's most unusual commodities, urine destined for the city's laundry industry. The story of Rome's urine tax is fundamentally a story about laundry, chemistry, and economics colliding in ways that reveal both Roman ingenuity and pragmatism. To understand why anyone would want to collect urine, let alone tax it, we need to first understand the vital role that clean clothing played in Roman society, and the surprising effectiveness of urine as a cleaning agent. In Roman society, appearance mattered immensely. The gleaming white toga of a senator, the crisp tunic of a merchant, the spotless stola of a matron. These weren't just clothing items, but symbols of status, respectability, and civic participation. Romans of all social classes, from the patrician elite to the plebeian masses, needed their garments cleaned regularly. But in an era before synthetic detergents, before washing machines, before even basic soap was widely available for laundry, how did Romans keep their clothes clean? Enter the fullers, or fullones in Latin. These were the professional launderers of the Roman world, and their workshops, called fullonicae, dotted every major Roman city. The fullers had perfected a cleaning process that might sound repulsive to modern sensibilities, but was remarkably effective. At the heart of their technique was human urine, aged and fermented to maximize its cleaning power. The chemistry behind this practice was sound, even if the Romans didn't fully understand it in modern terms. Human urine contains urea, which breaks down over time into ammonia. This ammonia, being alkaline, is excellent at breaking down organic materials, particularly the oils and grease that accumulate on clothing. In essence, the fullers were using a natural degreasing agent that could penetrate fabric fibers and lift away dirt and stains. The fulling process was labour-intensive and required considerable skill. When a Roman citizen brought their soiled garments to a fullonica, the clothes would first be sorted and inspected. Delicate items required different treatment than sturdy wool cloaks. The garments would then be placed in large stone or terracotta vats, often built into the floor of the workshop. These vats, called lacunae, were filled with a mixture of water and aged urine. Here's where the process became particularly memorable. Workers, usually slaves or freedmen, would step into these vats and literally dance on the clothes. This treading, or saltatio fullonica as it was sometimes called, could go on for hours. The workers would hold onto wooden beams or ropes suspended above the vats for balance as they rhythmically stamped and pressed the fabric with their feet. The combination of the ammonia from the urine and the mechanical action of treading worked to release dirt and oils from the fabric. But the fuller's work didn't end with the urine treatment. After the initial cleaning, the garments would be rinsed multiple times in clean water to remove the ammonia smell. Then came additional treatments, depending on the fabric and the desired finish. White garments might be bleached using sulfur fumes or rubbed with special types of clay called fuller's earth. Coloured fabrics might be re-dyed or have their colours refreshed. The final stages involved careful drying, pressing with specialised tools, and sometimes even perfuming the garments with pleasant scents to ensure no trace of the cleaning process remained. Archaeological evidence from Pompeii has given us remarkable insights into how these Fulonicae operated. The city, frozen in time by the eruption of Vesuvius in 79 CE, preserved several fulling establishments in extraordinary detail. The Fulonica of Stephanus on the Via dell'Abbondanza is perhaps the best preserved. Here, archaeologists found the telltale vats for treading, the rinsing basins, the drying areas, and even some of the tools used in the finishing process. The walls of Pompeian Fulonicae also preserve fascinating glimpses into the daily life of these establishments. Frescoes depict workers treading cloth, handling garments, and using various tools of their trade. One particularly charming painting shows what appears to be a clothes press in operation. Graffiti scratched into the walls includes work tallies, casual observations, and the occasional crude joke, reminders that these were real workplaces staffed by real people going about their daily business. The demand for urine in the fulling industry created an entire collection and distribution system. Those terracotta jars placed around the city weren't just convenient facilities for pedestrians, they were the first link in a supply chain. Professional collectors, sometimes called by the rather undignified title of urine farmers, would make regular rounds to empty these vessels. The collected urine would be transported to the Fulonicae, where it would be stored in large containers to age and concentrate. Some fullers maintained their own collection points directly outside their shops. Others relied on middlemen who specialized in procuring and delivering urine. The scale of this trade was considerable. A single large Fulonica might require hundreds of gallons of urine per week. In a city like Rome, with a population exceeding 1 million at its height, the logistics of collection and distribution represented a significant undertaking. The fullers weren't the only consumers of urine in Roman society, though they were certainly the largest. Tanners used urine in processing leather. Some agricultural operations used it as fertilizer. There's even evidence that some Roman physicians prescribed aged urine for certain medical conditions, though this was less common than its industrial uses. But it was the fulling industry that created consistent, large-scale demand for what would otherwise have been waste. Into this established system stepped Emperor Vespasian, a man who would forever link his name to the taxation of urine. To understand why an emperor would concern himself with such a seemingly trivial matter, we need to understand the dire financial situation Vespasian inherited when he came to power in 69 CE. The year 69 CE is known to historians as the Year of the Four Emperors, a period of civil war and chaos that nearly tore the Roman Empire apart. Following Nero's suicide in 68 CE, 3 emperors, Galba, Otho, and Vitellius, had risen and fallen in rapid succession. Each transition involved military conflict, bribery of troops, and massive expenditures. The imperial treasury was depleted, the economy was in shambles, and the new emperor faced the daunting task of restoring both financial and political stability. Vespasian was an unlikely emperor in many ways. Born Titus Flavius Vespasianus in 9 CE, he came from a relatively modest background. His family were equestrians, the Roman middle class rather than the ancient patrician nobility. His father was a tax collector and moneylender in Asia Minor, while his mother came from a slightly more distinguished family. Vespasian had risen through military service, commanding legions in Britain and Judea, earning a reputation as a competent, no-nonsense commander. Contemporary historians paint a picture of Vespasian as practical, sometimes crude, but generally effective. Suetonius, writing several decades after Vespasian's death, describes him as having a peasant sensibility about money, careful, even stingy, but not corrupt. He was known for his earthy sense of humour and his lack of pretension. These qualities would serve him well as he tackled the empire's financial crisis. When Vespasian arrived in Rome in 70 CE, he found an empire that had been living beyond its means for years. Nero's extravagances, including the construction of the massive Domus Aurea Palace complex, had drained the treasury. The civil wars had required enormous payments to secure the loyalty of various legions. Public buildings had been damaged in the fighting and required repair. The regular expenses of running an empire, paying the army, maintaining infrastructure, feeding Rome's urban masses, continued regardless of the state of the treasury. Vespasian's response was comprehensive fiscal reform. He increased existing taxes, instituted new ones, and looked for revenue wherever it could be found. He reclaimed public lands that Nero had given away to favourites. He increased tribute from the provinces. He reinstated taxes that Galba had abolished in his brief reign. He even found ways to charge for services that had previously been free, including famously the use of public latrines. The Urine vectigal, or urine tax, was part of this broader programme of revenue enhancement. The exact mechanism of the tax has been debated by historians. Some argue that it was a tax on the fullers themselves, essentially a licence fee for the right to collect and use urine. Others suggest it was a tax on the collectors, the middlemen who gathered urine from public vessels and sold it to the fullers. Still others propose it might have been a more general tax on public latrine usage, though this seems less likely given the practical difficulties of collection. What seems most probable, based on the fragmentary evidence we have, is that the tax targeted the commercial use of urine rather than its production. The fullers, as the primary commercial consumers, would have been the logical point of taxation. They were established businesses with fixed locations, making tax collection relatively straightforward. The tax might have been structured as an annual licence fee, a percentage of business revenue, or a fee based on the volume of urine consumed. The implementation of such a tax would have required some administrative infrastructure. Tax farmers, private contractors who paid the state a fixed sum for the right to collect certain taxes, might have been employed. Alternatively, imperial procurators and their staff might have handled collection directly. Records would need to be kept, payments tracked, and compliance ensured. In typical Roman fashion, the system probably combined efficiency with a certain acceptance of moderate corruption and inefficiency as the price of doing business. The urine tax quickly became a subject of controversy and mockery. Even in a society that was generally accepting of bodily functions as a fact of life, there was something inherently undignified about taxing urine. Elite Romans, always sensitive to matters of dignity and propriety, found the tax particularly offensive. It seemed to represent a new low in imperial money-grubbing, a violation of some unspoken boundary between acceptable taxation and shameless profiteering. It was in this context that one of history's most famous exchanges about money allegedly took place. According to Suetonius, writing in his biography of Vespasian, the emperor's son Titus objected to the urine tax as beneath imperial dignity. Titus, who would later succeed his father as emperor, was reportedly embarrassed by the association of the imperial office with such a base source of revenue. Vespasian's response was both practical and philosophical. He allegedly took a coin that had been collected from the first payment of the urine tax and held it under his son's nose. "Does it smell?" he asked. When Titus admitted that it did not, Vespasian delivered the line that would echo through the centuries, "Atqui ex lotio est," yet it comes from urine. The phrase would later be condensed into the more famous maxim pecunia non olet, money doesn't stink, or money has no smell. Whether this exchange actually happened, as Suetonius describes, is impossible to verify. Ancient historians often included apocryphal anecdotes that illustrated character traits or moral lessons. But the story's survival and transformation into a proverb suggests it captured something essential about Roman attitudes toward money and pragmatism. The phrase pecunia non olet entered the Latin lexicon, and from there spread throughout European languages, becoming a cynical justification for profiting from unsavoury sources. The genius of Vespasian's supposed response lay in its simplicity. Money, once in circulation, carries no trace of its origin. A gold aureus earned from taxing urine was indistinguishable from one earned from taxing grain or conquering territories. The moral qualms about the source were, in Vespasian's view, irrelevant to the practical needs of running an empire. This philosophy, pragmatic, unsentimental, focused on results rather than appearances, characterized much of Vespasian's reign. The fuller's trade, meanwhile, continued to thrive under the new tax regime. If anything, the imperial attention, however unwelcome, legitimized their industry as an essential part of urban life. The archaeological record from this period shows no decline in the number or size of Fulonicae. Business carried on as usual, with the tax simply becoming another cost of operation, likely passed on to customers in the form of slightly higher prices. We can glimpse the social dynamics around the fulling trade through various sources. Martial, the satirist writing during the Flavian period, makes several references to fullers and their work. In one epigram, he jokes about a man whose toga is so brilliantly white that it outshines the snow, suggesting the fullers have outdone themselves. In another, he mocks someone for wearing a toga that clearly hasn't seen a fuller's shop in too long. These references suggest that Romans were highly conscious of the state of their clothing and the role fullers played in maintaining appearances. Inscriptions from various Roman cities provide additional insights. Epitaphs of fullers often mention their profession with apparent pride. One from Rome reads, "Here lies Marcus Quintilius Eros, fuller, who lived 52 years. He was a good man. His wife and children set up this monument." Electoral graffiti from Pompeii shows fullers actively participating in local politics, endorsing candidates and seeking office themselves. The Guild of Fullers appears to have been well organised and influential, at least at the local level. The physical evidence from Pompeii and other sites reveals the scale and sophistication of the fulling industry. The largest fullonicae were substantial enterprises employing dozens of workers. They required significant capital investment in infrastructure, the vats, the water supply systems, the drying areas, the finishing equipment. Some establishments show evidence of expansion and renovation over time, suggesting successful businesses that grew with demand. The working conditions in these establishments were undoubtedly challenging. The smell of ammonia would have been overwhelming, despite ventilation systems evident in the archaeological remains. The work was physically demanding, hours of treading cloth, hauling wet garments, working with caustic substances. Yet the fullers seem to have developed a degree of professional pride. Wall paintings from Pompeii show workers engaged in various stages of the fulling process, depicted with care and attention to detail that suggests respect for the craft. The social status of fullers was complex. On one hand, they performed an essential service and could accumulate considerable wealth. Successful fullers owned property, slaves, and participated in civic life. On the other hand, their association with urine and other bodily substances placed them in an ambiguous position. They were necessary but not entirely respectable, wealthy but not elite. This tension appears in various sources, from legal texts that regulated their activities to literary references that alternate between mockery and grudging respect. The ecological aspects of the fulling industry are worth considering from our modern perspective. In many ways, the Roman system represented a remarkably efficient form of recycling. Human waste that would otherwise have posed sanitation challenge was transformed into a valuable industrial input. The ammonia from urine was a renewable resource, constantly replenished by the urban population. After use, the diluted urine would eventually make its way into the sewage system or agricultural fields, where its nitrogen content could benefit plant growth. Compare this to modern laundry practices, which rely on synthetic detergents derived from petroleum products, require enormous amounts of fresh water, and produce wastewater contaminated with complex chemicals. The Roman system, for all its apparent primitiveness, had certain environmental advantages. It used a waste product as a resource, required less water overall, and produced biodegradable waste. Of course, this isn't to romanticize the system. The sanitation challenges and health risks were real, but it does highlight how different societies solve similar problems in radically different ways. The transportation and storage of urine presented its own challenges and solutions. The collected urine needed to age to develop its full ammonia content, which meant storage facilities were necessary. Large ceramic dolia, partially buried in the ground to keep the contents cool, served this purpose. The logistics of moving hundreds of gallons of urine through city streets required specialized vehicles and containers. Spillage must have been a constant concern, and one can imagine the various regulations and customs that developed around this peculiar trade. The economics of the urine trade extended beyond the simple transaction between collectors and fullers. The placement of collection vessels was likely regulated and possibly subject to fees or permissions. Property owners might have negotiated for collection points near their buildings. The routes of collectors would have been valuable assets, perhaps inherited or sold like other commercial territories. The whole system represents a fascinating example of how markets develop around even the most unlikely commodities when demand exists. Vespasian's reign, which lasted from 69 to 79 CE, saw the gradual restoration of imperial finances. The combination of new taxes, careful management, and renewed confidence in government stability refilled the treasury. Major public works projects resumed, most notably the construction of the Flavian Amphitheatre, better known today as the Colosseum, on the site of Nero's demolished palace. The urine tax, while perhaps the most memorable of Vespasian's revenue measures, was just one small part of this broader fiscal recovery. The emperor's pragmatic approach to governance extended beyond taxation. He professionalized the imperial administration, appointing competent officials regardless of their social background. He restored discipline to the legions, while avoiding the military adventurism that had bankrupted previous emperors. He cultivated a public image of accessibility and modest living, in deliberate contrast to Nero's extravagance. Even his famous last words, "I think I'm becoming a god," spoken with characteristic irony as he lay dying, reflected his down-to-earth sensibility. The survival of the urine tax beyond Vespasian's reign is difficult to trace with certainty. His son Titus, who supposedly objected to the tax, ruled for only 2 years before his own death. Domitian, Vespasian's younger son, who succeeded Titus, was known for his more autocratic style, and might well have maintained any revenue source he inherited. Later, emperors presumably made their own decisions about which taxes to maintain, raise, lower, or abolish, based on fiscal needs and political calculations. What we do know is that the fulling industry continued to thrive throughout the imperial period and beyond. Archaeological evidence from the 2nd, 3rd, and 4th centuries shows Phalonicae operating in cities across the empire. The techniques remained remarkably consistent. The same vats for treading, the same basic processes, the same reliance on urine as a cleaning agent. Whether these later fullers paid a specific urine tax or simply general business taxes is unclear, but their industry remained an urban constant. The linguistic legacy of Vespasian's tax proved more durable than the tax itself. Pecunia non olet entered the pantheon of Latin maxims taught to students and quoted by moralists. Medieval writers used it both approvingly and disapprovingly, depending on their purpose. Renaissance humanists debated its implications for Christian ethics. Enlightenment philosophers cited it in discussions of economics and morality. The phrase became a shorthand for the moral neutrality of money, and by extension, the dangerous willingness to profit from any source. In France, public urinals came to be called Vespasiennes, in honor of the tax-imposing emperor, a usage that persisted well into the 20th century. This linguistic monument to Vespasian's pragmatism outlasted most physical monuments, an ironic form of immortality for an emperor who prided himself on practical achievements rather than grand gestures. The broader question raised by the urine tax, how should governments balance revenue needs against dignity and public opinion, remains relevant today. Modern governments tax alcohol, tobacco, gambling, and other activities that some consider unseemly. Carbon taxes attempt to put a price on pollution. Fees for waste disposal turn garbage into a revenue source. Each of these echoes, in its own way, Vespasian's insight that government can extract value from what others discard or disdain. The environmental parallels are particularly striking in our current era of ecological awareness. The Roman system of turning waste into resource anticipates modern concepts of circular economy and industrial ecology. Today's wastewater treatment plants extract phosphorus and nitrogen for fertilizer, recover energy from sewage, and seek ways to transform waste streams into value streams. The fullers of ancient Rome, collecting urine for its ammonia content, were early practitioners of what we now call resource recovery. The social dynamics around waste and cleanliness also resonate across the centuries. Just as Romans needed clean togas to participate fully in public life, modern people require clean clothing for social and professional acceptance. Just as Roman fullers occupied an ambiguous social position, necessary but not entirely respectable, modern sanitation workers often face similar contradictions. They perform essential services, but rarely receive the social recognition given to other professions. The Roman experience reminds us that these tensions between necessity and dignity, between service and status, are ancient and perhaps inherent to urban civilization. From a technical standpoint, The Roman fulling process demonstrates sophisticated empirical knowledge developed through centuries of practice. The fullers might not have understood the chemistry of ammonia or the molecular structure of wool fibres, but they knew what worked. They knew how long to age urine for maximum effectiveness, what proportions to use for different fabrics, how to remove the smell completely, how to restore the texture and appearance of well-worn garments. This practical expertise, passed down through apprenticeships and guild traditions, represents a form of technological knowledge often overlooked in histories focused on monumental architecture and military engineering. The guild structure of the fulling trade also provides insights into Roman commercial organisation. The collegia of fullers, found in many cities, suggest sophisticated professional associations that regulated standards, resolved disputes, provided mutual aid, and represented their members' interests to local authorities. These organisations prefigure medieval guilds and modern trade associations, showing continuities in how skilled workers organised themselves across centuries. The religious and ritual aspects of the fulling trade add another dimension to our understanding. Some Philonici include small shrines to Minerva, goddess of crafts, or to other deities associated with commercial success. The October festival of the Quinquatrus was particularly important to fullers, who would decorate their shops and make offerings for continued prosperity. These religious observances remind us that even the most mundane commercial activities were embedded in a sacred worldview that sought divine favour for human enterprises. Literary references to fullers and their work extend beyond the satirists and historians already mentioned. In Plautus's comedies, written in the Republican period before Vespasian's tax, fullers appear as stock characters, sometimes honest tradesmen, sometimes suspicious figures who might steal or damage the clothes entrusted to them. These portrayals suggest that tensions around the fulling trade predated the imperial tax and reflected deeper anxieties about trusting others with valuable possessions and about the respectability of those who worked with waste products. The spread of Roman fulling techniques throughout the empire represents an interesting case study in technology transfer. Archaeological evidence from Britain, Gaul, Spain, North Africa, and the eastern provinces shows Philonicae built on the Roman model, complete with treading vats and similar layouts. Local variations emerged, different types of clay used for fuller's earth, variations in the design of drying areas to accommodate local climates. But the basic technology remained consistent. This standardization across vast distances speaks to the effectiveness of Roman commercial and technical culture in spreading best practices. The question of slave versus free labour in the fulling industry touches on fundamental aspects of the Roman economy. While the treading work was often performed by slaves, the skilled finishing work and business management frequently involved free workers and freedmen. Many successful fullers were themselves freedmen who had earned enough to buy their freedom and establish their own businesses. The fulling trade thus provided one avenue for social mobility in a highly stratified society, even as it depended on the unfree labour that underpinned much of the Roman economy. The health implications of working in Philonicae deserve consideration. Constant exposure to ammonia fumes would have caused respiratory problems. The physical demands of treading for hours would have led to joint and muscle problems. The handling of dirty clothing exposed workers to various diseases. Yet fullers seem to have lived to reasonable ages, judging from epitaphs, suggesting either that the health risks were manageable or that only the hardy survived long in the trade. Roman medical texts occasionally mention treatments for ailments associated with fulling work, showing awareness of these occupational hazards. The decline of the Western Roman Empire didn't immediately end the fulling trade, but it did transform it. As cities shrank and trade networks fragmented, the large-scale urban Philonicae gave way to smaller operations. Medieval fulling would eventually incorporate new technologies. Water-powered fulling mills replaced foot treading in many areas, but the basic chemistry remained the same. Urine continued to be used in cloth processing well into the early modern period in some regions, a testament to its effectiveness despite the availability of alternatives. The rediscovery of Pompeii in the 18th century brought renewed attention to Roman fulling practices. Early excavators were simultaneously fascinated and repelled by the evidence of urine use in the ancient laundry industry. Victorian-era scholars, with their particular sensitivities about bodily functions, sometimes downplayed or euphemized this aspect of Roman life. More recent archaeology has taken a matter-of-fact approach, recognizing urine use as simply one of many practical solutions Romans developed for urban challenges. Modern experimental archaeology has attempted to recreate Roman fulling techniques with mixed results. The process works, urine does clean wool effectively, but modern recreators often struggle with the quantities needed and the logistics of collection and storage. These experiments have increased appreciation for the skill and organization required to make the system work on an industrial scale. They've also confirmed that the smell, while strong during processing, could indeed be completely eliminated from the finished garments through proper rinsing and finishing techniques. The lessons of the urine tax extend beyond historical curiosity to contemporary policy debates. As governments grapple with funding public services, the question of what constitutes a legitimate object of taxation remains contentious. Should governments tax sugary drinks to fund healthcare? Should carbon emissions be taxed to fund environmental remediation? Should financial transactions be taxed to fund social programs? Each of these proposals echoes in its own way Vespasian's willingness to find revenue in unexpected places, regardless of elite sensibilities. The circular economy movement has explicitly embraced the Roman example of waste as resource. Modern proponents cite the fuller's use of urine as an early example of industrial symbiosis, where the waste product of one process becomes the input for another. This framing transforms what might seem like a distasteful historical curiosity into a precedent for sustainable industrial practices. The Romans, in this view, were pioneering eco-entrepreneurs who recognized value where others saw only waste. The persistence of the phrase pecunia non olet in modern usage, it appears in multiple languages and contexts, suggests its continued relevance. In Italian, I soldi non puzzano carries the same meaning. In English, we might say, money has no smell, or more colloquially, dirty money spends the same as clean. The concept appears in discussions of everything from money laundering to ethical investing, usually as a cynical observation about human nature rather than an endorsement of a moral profit-seeking. Yet Vespasian's original point, if we take Suetonius's account at face value, was more subtle than simple cynicism. He wasn't arguing that any source of money was acceptable, but rather that squeamishness about associating governance with bodily functions was a luxury the empire couldn't afford. The urine tax offended elite sensibilities, not because it was unjust or economically harmful, but because it forced acknowledgement of the bodily realities that polite society preferred to ignore. In this reading, pecunia non olet becomes less about moral indifference and more about practical honesty. The technological conservatism evident in the fulling industry, the same basic techniques used for centuries with only minor variations, might seem puzzling from our perspective of rapid technological change, but it reflects a common pattern in pre-industrial craft production. When a technique works well, is thoroughly understood, and is embedded in social and economic structures, there's little incentive to change. The fuller's methods were proven, efficient within their context, and supported by available infrastructure. Innovation for its own sake wasn't valued as it often is today. The gendered aspects of the fulling trade provide another angle of analysis. While the heavy treading work was typically performed by men, women appear in the record as workers in the finishing stages, as proprietors of smaller fulling operations, and as customers negotiating for services. The maintenance of household textiles was primarily women's responsibility, even if the actual washing was outsourced to professionals. This division of labour reflects broader patterns in Roman society, while also showing spaces where women exercised economic agency. The seasonal rhythms of the fulling trade influenced urban life in subtle ways. Demand peaked around major festivals when everyone needed their best clothes cleaned. The availability of water affected operations. Drought could shut down Folonicae that depended on abundant water for rinsing. The summer heat made the ammonia smell more pungent, possibly leading to neighbourhood complaints. These cycles remind us that ancient industries like modern ones operated within environmental and social constraints that shaped their daily practices. As we near the end of our exploration, it's worth reflecting on what the story of Rome's urine tax reveals about human nature and social organisation. At its heart, this is a story about problem-solving, how a complex urban society dealt with the universal need for clean clothing using available resources. It's about entrepreneurship, how individuals built businesses around meeting that need. It's about governance, how the state extracted revenue from economic activity. And it's about values, how different groups in society negotiated between practical needs and cultural sensibilities. The Fullers themselves emerge from the historical record as skilled professionals who took pride in their work despite its associations with waste and smell. They organised themselves, participated in civic life, worshipped their gods, and passed their knowledge to the next generation. Their customers, from senators to shopkeepers, relied on their services to maintain the appearances that Roman society demanded. The entire system, from street corner collection jars to finished white togas, represents human ingenuity applied to fundamental needs. Vespasian's tax, whether we see it as pragmatic governance or shameless money grubbing, succeeded in its immediate goal of raising revenue. But its greater success was in generating a story that has outlasted the Roman Empire itself. The image of an emperor holding a coin to his son's nose and declaring that money has no smell captures something essential about power, pragmatism, and the sometimes uncomfortable realities of governance. It reminds us that running a state, like running a household or a business, sometimes requires setting aside squeamishness in favour of practical solutions. The environmental lessons of the Roman approach deserve emphasis as we face our own challenges of urban sustainability. The Romans showed that waste could be resource, that circular systems could function at scale, and that economic incentives could align with environmental benefits. Their solution wouldn't work in modern cities, the health risks alone would be prohibitive, but the underlying principle of finding value in waste streams remains sound and increasingly urgent. The social negotiations around the fulling trade, between necessity and respectability, between service providers and customers, between economic value and social status, mirror tensions in every complex society. Today's essential workers who handle waste, maintain sanitation, and perform other stigmatized but necessary tasks face similar contradictions. The Roman experience suggests these tensions are inherent to urban civilization rather than unique to any particular culture or era. As our story concludes, we return to those terracotta jars on Roman street corners, humble monuments to human practicality. Each day, thousands of Romans contributed to them, probably without thinking much about the complex system they were feeding. Collectors emptied them, fullers processed the contents, and clean clothes emerged to dress the population of the eternal city. Tax collectors took their share, funding the government that maintained the roads, aqueducts, and laws that made the whole system possible. In this light, the urine tax becomes more than a historical curiosity or a source of scatological humour. It represents the countless mundane arrangements that make civilization possible, the unglamorous but essential systems that turn waste into resource, chaos into order, individual needs into collective solutions. These systems, whether in ancient Rome or modern metropolises, require pragmatic leadership, willing to pursue effective solutions even when they offend refined sensibilities. The phrase pecunia non olet has survived 2 millennia, not because it represents some profound philosophical truth, but because it captures a recurring tension in human societies. We want our governments to be dignified and our money to be clean, but we also want our problems solved and our needs met. Sometimes these desires conflict, and when they do, practical leaders choose effectiveness over appearances. Vespasian's urine tax reminds us that this choice, while never comfortable, is sometimes necessary. So the next time you drop off laundry at a modern cleaner, spare a thought for the Roman fullers who pioneered the professional cleaning industry. When you see a portable toilet at a construction site or public event, remember those Roman collection jars that turned waste into valuable commodity. When politicians debate whether to tax carbon emissions or plastic bags or sugary drinks, hear the echo of ancient debates about dignity, necessity, and the proper scope of government revenue seeking. The Romans left us magnificent architecture, sophisticated law codes, great literature, and engineering marvels. But they also left us this humbler lesson, that successful societies find ways to turn necessities into opportunities, waste into wealth, and problems into solutions. They showed that pragmatism and civic dignity need not be opposites, that acknowledging bodily realities doesn't diminish human achievement, and that sometimes the most important innovations are the ones that help us deal with the most basic human needs. In the end, the story of Rome's urine tax is fundamentally about human ingenuity and adaptation. Faced with the universal need for clean clothing and the particular challenges of urban density, the Romans developed a system that worked. When faced with fiscal crisis, they found revenue where others might have seen only waste. The system they created supported thousands of livelihoods, maintained public health and appearance, and contributed to the functioning of one of history's most successful civilizations. The fullers' vats of Pompeii stand empty now, visited by tourists who marvel at ancient ingenuity while perhaps feeling grateful for modern washing machines. The phrase pecunia non olet lives on in dictionaries and occasional usage, mostly divorced from its original context. Vespasian is remembered more for beginning the Colosseum than for taxing urine. But in their time, these elements came together to solve real problems for real people, and in that practical success lies a lesson that transcends the peculiarities of its historical moment. As we close our exploration of this remarkable chapter in human history, we're reminded that civilization advances not just through grand gestures and noble ideals, but through countless practical solutions to everyday problems. The Romans who contributed to those street corner jars, the fullers who transformed that waste into cleaning power, the emperor who saw taxable value in the whole system, all played their parts in maintaining the complex urban society that was Rome. Their story, preserved in stone and text and proverbial wisdom, continues to inform and inspire those who grapple with the eternal challenges of city life, resource management, and pragmatic governance. Money, as Vespasian allegedly observed, truly has no smell, but the human stories behind how that money is earned, collected, and spent, these retain their pungency across the centuries, reminding us of the ingenuity, adaptability, and occasional absurdity of our species' long experiment in living together in cities. The urine tax of ancient Rome, in all its peculiar glory, stands as testament to these enduring human qualities, a reminder that progress often comes from the most unexpected sources, and that solutions to our challenges might be hiding in what we're too refined to notice.